September 21, 1939, marked a decisive moment in the early stages of World War II as the siege of Warsaw reached a critical point. With German forces surrounding the Polish capital and Soviet troops firmly in control of the eastern territories, the last remnants of Polish resistance were on the verge of collapse. The day's events highlighted the brutal realities of occupation, the strategic calculations of the occupying forces, and the global reactions to the rapidly unfolding situation. As the world watched, Poland's struggle against two of the most powerful military machines of the era came to a tragic conclusion. The Siege of Warsaw, preparing for the end. By September 21st, the situation in Warsaw had become untenable. The German Wehrmacht had tightened its encirclement of the city, and the continuous bombardment by the Luftwaffe had reduced much of Warsaw to rubble. The constant artillery fire and aerial attacks left the city in ruins, with critical infrastructure destroyed and civilian casualties mounting daily. Food and medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and the civilian population faced starvation and disease. The defenders of Warsaw, composed of regular Polish army units, local militias, and civilian volunteers, continued to hold out despite the overwhelming odds. Under the leadership of General Walerian Chuma and Mayor Stefan Starzyński, efforts were made to maintain a semblance of order and to prepare for the inevitable. Starzyński's radio broadcasts continued to rally the city's population, urging them to stand firm in the face of the German onslaught, but the resolve was beginning to wane as the reality of the situation set in. On September 21st, the German forces intensified their efforts to break the will of Warsaw's defenders. The Wehrmacht prepared for a final ground assault, aiming to capture the city and bring the campaign in Poland to a close. German commanders were keen to avoid the costly street-to-street fighting that would result from a prolonged urban battle, and they hoped that continued bombardment and the threat of starvation would force the city to surrender without further bloodshed. Within the city, discussions among Warsaw's leadership grew increasingly desperate. The choice was stark: continue to resist in the hope of inflicting additional casualties on the Germans and buying time for any potential relief that might come from the Allies, or surrender to prevent further civilian suffering and destruction. With no realistic prospect of outside support, many began to see surrender as the only viable option to spare the city from total annihilation. Soviet occupation, consolidating control and repression. While Warsaw faced its imminent fate, the Soviet Union continued to consolidate its control over eastern Poland. Following the rapid advance of Soviet forces into the region after their invasion on September 17th, the Red Army had quickly established itself as the dominant power in the east. On September 21st, Soviet authorities took further steps to integrate the occupied territories into the Soviet state, dismantling existing administrative structures and replacing them with Soviet-appointed officials. The occupation was marked by a wave of political repression aimed at neutralizing any potential opposition to Soviet rule. Thousands of Polish military officers, civil servants, landowners, and intellectuals were arrested and deported to labor camps in Siberia and other remote regions. These actions were part of a broader strategy to eliminate any elements that could challenge Soviet authority and to reshape Eastern Poland according to communist principles. In addition to political repression, the Soviet authorities began to implement economic and social reforms aimed at integrating the region into the Soviet system. This included the nationalization of industries, the collectivization of agriculture, and the imposition of Soviet cultural and educational policies. The local population, already traumatized by the rapid change in power and the brutality of the Soviet occupation, faced further hardships as they were forced to adapt to a new and oppressive regime. German occupation, establishing control and enforcing order. In western Poland, the German occupation forces continued to assert their control over the territories they had captured. The rapid collapse of Polish resistance allowed the Wehrmacht to focus on establishing a stable occupation regime, which involved both military and civilian efforts to pacify the region and integrate it into the Greater German Reich. On September 21st, German authorities implemented a series of measures aimed at consolidating their control over occupied Poland. This included the imposition of martial law, the establishment of military checkpoints, and the systematic rounding up of Polish resistance leaders, intellectuals, and other figures deemed a threat to German rule. The Gestapo and other Nazi security agencies played a central role in these efforts, using a combination of surveillance, intimidation, and violence to suppress any potential resistance. The German occupation was characterized by a brutal regime of repression and exploitation. Forced labor was imposed on the Polish population, with thousands of Poles deported to Germany to work in factories, farms, and other enterprises essential to the Nazi war effort. The occupation authorities also began to implement policies aimed at the Germanization of the region, including the forced displacement of Polish populations and the settlement of ethnic Germans in their place. German propaganda continued to portray the invasion of Poland as a defensive measure aimed at protecting Germany from external threats and securing its eastern borders. This narrative was used to justify the harsh measures being implemented in the occupied territories and to maintain domestic support for the war effort. For the Polish population, the German occupation represented a period of intense suffering and repression, marked by violence, coercion, and the systematic destruction of Polish society. The Allied response: strategic confusion and public outcry. As Poland's fate became increasingly clear, the Allied powers, particularly the United Kingdom and France, faced growing criticism for their perceived inaction and strategic indecision. The complete occupation of Poland by German and Soviet forces forced the Allies to confront a new reality. Their Eastern European ally had been effectively erased from the map, and the strategic balance in Europe had shifted dramatically. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's government faced intense scrutiny for its handling of the crisis. Public opinion was increasingly critical of the government's failure to take more decisive action in defense of Poland, with many feeling that Britain had not fulfilled its obligations to its ally. On September 21st, the British War Cabinet continued to debate potential responses, including the possibility of increasing military aid to other nations threatened by Axis aggression and expanding economic sanctions against both Germany and the Soviet Union. However, logistical challenges and concerns about military readiness continued to constrain the British response. The Royal Air Force, RAF, remained focused on defensive preparations, while the Royal Navy maintained its blockade of Germany in an effort to weaken the Nazi war machine through economic attrition. The British government also explored ways to support Polish forces that had escaped to France and other countries, recognizing the need to keep the Polish cause alive even as Poland itself fell under occupation. In France, the government of Prime Minister Édouard Daladier faced similar challenges. The French military, heavily focused on defending the Maginot Line and preparing for a potential German offensive in the west, was not in a position to intervene directly in Poland. The French public, like their British counterparts, was increasingly frustrated with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. The complete occupation of Poland forced France to reassess its strategic priorities and how best to support the Allied cause in an increasingly hostile environment. The failure of the Allies to provide more substantial support to Poland highlighted broader strategic dilemmas. Both the British and French governments were wary of provoking a broader conflict before they were fully prepared, but this cautious approach also meant that Poland had been left to face the German and Soviet onslaught largely alone. The events of September 21st underscored the limitations of the Allied military and diplomatic strategies and the need for a more coordinated and decisive approach to countering the Axis and Soviet threats. International reactions, diplomatic maneuvers, and strategic recalculations. The continued occupation of Poland by German and Soviet forces and the imminent fall of Warsaw prompted strong reactions from the international community. Many nations began to reassess their positions and strategies in response to the rapidly changing landscape of the war. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt maintained a stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential implications of the conflict for global stability. On September 21st, discussions within the U.S. government continued to focus on expanding support to the Allies, including economic and material aid through measures like the cash-and-carry policy. This policy, allowing belligerents to purchase arms from the U.S. provided they transported the goods themselves, gained further support as a means of aiding Britain and France while maintaining American neutrality. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's regime continued to advocate for a negotiated peace, positioning Italy as a potential mediator in the conflict. On September 21st, Mussolini reiterated his proposal for an international conference to resolve the war, seeking to bolster Italy's diplomatic standing while avoiding direct involvement in the conflict. However, this offer was largely dismissed by the Western Allies, who viewed it as an attempt to weaken their resolve and buy time for the Axis powers. Other neutral nations, such as Switzerland, Sweden, and the Netherlands, continued to bolster their defenses and prepare for potential spillover from the conflict. These countries, aware of their strategic positions and vulnerabilities, sought to maintain their neutrality while preparing for potential threats from both the Axis and Allied powers. The situation was particularly tense in Belgium and the Netherlands, where fears of German invasion prompted increased military readiness and diplomatic efforts to secure guarantees of neutrality. Media coverage and global public opinion. On September 21st, media coverage around the world continued to focus on the dramatic events unfolding in Poland and the broader strategic implications of the war. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels provided updates on the military situation and the responses of the belligerent nations, shaping public perceptions and understanding of the conflict. In the United Kingdom, the BBC and major newspapers like The Times and The Daily Telegraph reported on the continued siege of Warsaw and the firm establishment of Soviet control in eastern Poland with a sense of urgency and condemnation. Coverage emphasized the plight of the Polish people and the need for a more robust Allied response. Editorials called for increased support for other potential victims of Axis aggression and debated the merits of launching an offensive against Germany versus continuing a more cautious approach. In France, newspapers such as Le Figaro and Le Monde highlighted the humanitarian crisis in Warsaw and the broader implications of the Soviet and German occupations. The French press reflected the public's growing anxiety and frustration with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. Opinion pieces called for greater coordination with the British and a more aggressive stance to support Poland, while others warned of the risks of escalating the conflict without adequate preparation. In Germany, state-controlled media continued to portray the invasion of Poland as a necessary and justified action, emphasizing the successes of the Wehrmacht and the righteousness of Germany's actions. Propaganda outlets like Völkischer Beobachter and Der Angriff highlighted the military victories and portrayed the campaign as a defensive struggle against foreign aggression. The propaganda aimed to maintain public morale and support for the war effort, even as the realities of a prolonged conflict began to take shape. In the Soviet Union, state media maintained a narrative of neutrality and defense, presenting the invasion as a necessary step to protect ethnic minorities and restore order in Eastern Europe. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts portrayed the Red Army as liberators, bringing stability and protection to the peoples of the eastern regions of Poland. This narrative was designed to justify the Soviet actions both domestically and internationally, framing the intervention as a necessary step to prevent further chaos and bloodshed. Strategic implications and the road ahead. The events of September 21, 1939, underscored the rapidly changing dynamics of the conflict and the strategic dilemmas faced by all parties involved. For Poland, the day marked a further descent into occupation and repression, as the fall of Warsaw seemed imminent and the country was effectively divided between two totalitarian powers. The Allied powers faced a complex set of challenges as they grappled with how best to respond to the dual threats of Nazi Germany and Soviet expansionism. For the United Kingdom and France, the day highlighted the difficulties of coalition warfare and the challenges of transitioning from peace to war. Both nations were still adjusting to the realities of a conflict they had hoped to avoid and were faced with strategic uncertainties regarding how best to respond to the expanding scope of the war. The debates over offensive versus defensive strategies, and the extent to which they could and should support other nations threatened by Axis aggression, reflected broader tensions within the Allied leadership that would continue to shape the early phases of the war. Internationally, the continued advance of German and Soviet forces into Poland prompted further reassessments and strategic recalibrations. The United States maintained its official stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential global implications of the conflict. Italy and other nations watched closely, each calculating how best to navigate the rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape to their advantage.